Good afternoon or good evening, wherever you may be listening to us from, here on this big, beautiful planet we call Earth. This is Michael Cross here with another edition of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV Productions, where we like to go places where the corporate media they just prefer not to. They just want to deal with entertainment and propaganda. But, there's more to life than that. And tonight we have a really great guest, but first, I got to make a plug. If you're listening to this later, when it goes onto YouTube, please go into the comment section and check out the link to my official website, and also check out my newest novel, The Destiny of Our Past. Yeah, The Destiny of Our Past, and it's a sci-fi set in the era of Noah, just before the flood. Anyway, so we have a returning guest, Professor Richard Sugg, and he's just written and published a book called A Century of Ghost Stories. This is going to be really fascinating now. So, Richard, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. It's great to talk again. Thanks.
Great. And I just have to start off. What got you interested in ghosts, of all things?
Yes, a long, slow process. I was studying, if I can begin with what seems a very different supernatural entity and a very famous one. I was studying vampires. I've got a book on vampires coming out this year as well. And there were a lot of weird things about vampires, what people believed about death, what they did to people that were supposed to be undead, what they did to the living that were supposed to be undead, was pretty strange and horrific. But the strangest thing, and kind of in a way the most troubling thing, was that they constantly said from one era to another, one country to another, that the vampire behaved like a poltergeist. It threw furniture over, it banged on the roof, it threw stones through windows in, I think it was Romania in the 20th century, in fact. So I read this so many times that I started trying to get my head around what poltergeists were themselves. I got a couple of basic books of historical cases and started reading this and had a strange feeling I suppose I've never had in my life, which was that I believed this and didn't believe it at the same time. It was so far off our normal scale of the possible, it didn't fit into our normal frames of reference or categories of belief, if you like. And yet it looked like these people were plausible. They were police officers, they were journalists, they were scientists, they were every kind of person witnessing or suffering this poltergeist. And there were a lot of physical details, a lot of surprisingly precise physical details about the phenomena, which you might know include mysterious fires, perhaps floods of water, hammering noises from nowhere, objects being hurled about, stones appearing from nowhere, and much, much more. So as I got into this, I realized that the poltergeists were a wholly separate phenomenon, and I started trying to think about this, caught, as it were, between belief and unbelief. And I started to put together a basic picture that time and again, if you get the smallest number of details, you are told that there's a kid of about 8 years to about 15 years or so in the house, that they're troubled for some reason. They might have lost a parent, quite a common one, or both parents, and they seem to be letting off steam in a radical way, that there's something bubbling up inside them, a pressure, trauma that can't be expressed, and then it's literally expressed, let out, as it were, in the form of these violent, often violent noises, hurlings of objects, smashings of this and that. And what becomes clearer still is that often if they flee the haunted house as they believe it, the events follow them. They simply follow them, and I've got a case which I can give you later where the events are utterly tragic, really. They follow a family in France in the 19th century for literally 20 years. I mean, they've ruined this family's life, I think it's fair to say. So I put together this picture. It's very strange. It's very weird. What was a bit weirder as well, but it kind of helped me start to cement the belief more firmly, was that for the first time in my life, I was talking to people about poltergeists. So I'd come out of the library, I'd meet someone for lunch, I'd say, have you ever come across poltergeists? And twice, quite quickly, people I'd known for many years, quite closely, said to me, yes, this has happened to me. Now, I talked to these people about a lot of things, a lot of difficult things, personal things over the years, but there's never a whisper of these stories, which were detailed, they made sense to me from what I'd heard. In one case, it did involve a ghost, quite definitely. And I realized, or started to suspect, that there's a lot of stories hanging around in people's heads. They don't tell these stories to other people unless they get the right kind of prompt. And in a way, I think sometimes they don't even tell these stories to themselves, if that makes sense, because it's so very difficult to place in any kind of category of the acceptable, the real. And I started to realize that actually studying this subject, you run into a lot of trouble, because you can study something strange, but it's very difficult when you study something that people don't believe exists. And I think we've possibly created a new taboo in the area of poltergeists and ghosts. So I spent quite a bit of time talking to people about poltergeists, and I would listen very avidly. I got lots of stories from people I knew slightly, people I just met, and so on. But what I tried to do was shut out ghosts. I thought, as a lifelong agnostic rationalist, I'm not really prepared to deal with ghosts. So along the way, people told me ghost stories, and I tended not really to listen to those. It's interesting how you can listen to one part and not another as suits you. But after, I suppose, a few months, I'd listened to so many ghost stories, and they looked so convincing that I started to take the ghost seriously. And when I did that, in a sense, the process repeated itself. I talked to people about ghosts, and they told me ghost stories. And I mean, sometimes you'd be down the swimming pool, you'd be in the sauna, and you'd get two in one night, literally, that you would never have heard if people hadn't known you were studying the topic.
Mm-hmm. So ultimately, then, you started finding that the people you were talking to were credible.
Yes.
And as you did research, did you have... Well, it must have been a process. If you start out just maybe thinking this was a psychological thing, perhaps, and then you started researching it and maybe finding that there were things that couldn't be explained by psychology, or was there some other path that led you to develop an interest and then want to share that interest in written form?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point, between psychology and, as it were, objectively inexplicable things. I'd emphasize, I think, that one thing that has taught me is that it's a very good idea to listen to people's stories, and it really helps if you can look that person in the eye. It helps even more if you know that person. I mean, two of the people that told me these stories in the first case were both academics. I don't know if that makes them more credible or not, but for the record, that's who they were. So, yes, I listened to a lot of stories. I realized that the stories are kind of an ambiguous thing. In a court of law, somebody's story means a hell of a lot. In other cases, it's just kind of brushed off as purely anecdotal. But, yeah, some of the things that I read that seemed very hard to explain away were little physical details. Poltergeist rappings, for example. If you look at 19th century cases, you see people sometimes saying the noises were very loud, but they were very odd. They didn't have an echo. They were very flat. Little detail wouldn't mean much to you unless you'd come across what I'd come across in the 20th century. And this was a physicist, a guy called Barry Colvin, who recorded, I think it was maybe about a dozen or more, poltergeist rappings. He was investigating the cases a lot of the time himself. This is the late 20th century. And he found, when he subjected these rappings on tape to analysis, a very peculiar thing. What he did was he analysed their acoustic signature. So if I, at the moment, I'm just getting the phone here in the right place, do that on the computer, it gives you an acoustic signature which would look a bit like kind of peaks and troughs, like an EEG machine. And that acoustic signature will tend to behave in a certain way. The sound will build up with a certain speed. It will die away after its peak with a certain speed, and so on. And if you record and analyse poltergeist rappings, they have a unique acoustic signature. I can rap on the walls and the table and the computer all night, and I will not be able to replicate that signature. So you've got something objectively very curious here, and yet which also checks out with an age that didn't have recording technology, and certainly not the analytic technology that Colvin was using. They say it sounds like the imitation of a noise. It sounds like something very flat without an echo, and so forth. So, yeah, this and many other physical details set me thinking, I don't think this has been made up. the behavior of the agent, the behavior of their body, the way that the energy of the poltergeist and or ghost seemed to be using their energy was very striking. So I'll give you a case which might not be ghostly. It's quite a famous one from 1870s in Canada, and this involved a young woman, I think about 20, called Esther Cox, living in a quite crowded house with the members of her family. She was single, and she shared a bed in this crowded house with her sister. So one night she was extremely agitated and started saying, there's a mouse. I think there's a mouse under the mattress. There's something under the bed, and they found a box, it was like a shoe box, I think, which seemed to be bouncing up and down as though a mouse was in it. And it would leap up and down. There was nothing in it whatsoever. Sister got her back to bed, and the next night, I think it might have been 2 or 3 nights altogether, there's a repetition of this. And Esther, at this stage, is standing up in a state of what I think it's fair to describe as imminent hysteria. She's shaking, she's extremely hot, red, and she's swollen, visibly swollen, as though she's almost going to burst. And from this state of agitation, with I think about 4 people in the room because they've been alerted by her sister, suddenly there's a huge crash. It sounds like thunder, and the mother runs across the house to see if her children are okay. Thinking it's a storm. She looks out. It's a clear night, and they come back and they find that Esther has visibly shrunk down from this state of swollen, near hysteria, might as well call it hysteria, and in a few minutes or even seconds, improbably she's back in the bed and she's asleep. Now, even if you don't know much about this subject, you can see a kind of seesaw effect here, probably, that there's something inside her. That something is expressed involuntarily, but very violently, in the form of this noise, and immediately she feels better. And this has actually been said by agents in more recent times. A wonderful smashing time was had by all in the 1960s when a poor guy was the agent for poltergeism in a souvenir warehouse. So you can imagine how this went down. And objects are hurtling about and smashing all the time. And the chap who's the agent of this, he was troubled in various ways, and he had psychoanalysis later on. He said sometimes immediately after an event, as you might call it, he said, "I feel better now." This sense that the body is being used, that it's using their energy, that in a few cases you get the impression that the events time themselves to certain times of the day very precisely. People who are reporting it are not interested in poltergeists or ghosts. They say this always happens at this time in the morning and at this time in the evening. I don't know for sure, but in an area where you're so far off the map, sometimes a guess is not a bad bet. This sounds a little bit like the circadian rhythms of the body at their peak times, at their most energetic times, being used by the ghost. Correspondingly to that also, in Esther Cox's case, which went on to be a highly aggravated poltergeist case, it almost burned the house down a few times. She had to leave the house because they were terrified of the fires. And in her case, the one time it stopped was when she was bedridden with diphtheria. So no energy, very little energy, no phenomena.
Mm-hmm. Are you saying that... Okay, I'm a little confused here. Are you saying that maybe it's like a walk-in? The idea that a person can be inhabited by a entity? Or is it something that might be just... I don't know. It's just the person themselves is maybe just acting out a certain way.
Yeah, both very good questions. I've got used to the fact that poltergeists and ghosts are not really like most of the Hollywood demonic stuff. It would make sense to be able to think, they're being inhabited, they're being possessed, as it were. You very, very rarely see that. What's interesting is that you only tend to see that when the Catholic Church gets involved in a kind of old school way, and the more they kind of ramp up the good and evil binary, the more kind of evil seems to inhabit the whole thing. I can't really explain that, but that's well attested. It just seems to be much more neutral in the cases I've seen, using this person's energy almost as though, and this is an argument that's been made, it would use the energy of a lot of electrical equipment in the house on standby. For example, this argument's been made, it's a bit less certain than the fact that it's using this person's that troubled, that frightened. As I say, sometimes they get relief. Now, the question I think you're asking as well is there a ghost involved, or is it just this person, producing extraordinary phenomena through emotional trauma and kind of saving themselves from hysteria, madness, etc.? The honest answer here, I think, is that it could be either. Quite a lot of cases look as though they are just a human but bizarre phenomenon, but a fair few cases, the ones I tried to shut out initially because I was having enough trouble coping with poltergeists, a fair few cases do look as though there's something intentive, as though there's an intentive personality that is essentially dead, responding in real time. I mean, in one or two cases, there are voices. There are highly articulate conversations that go on, with several witnesses. The police, as are often the case, are called in and hear this as well, and they seem to respond to what's actually happening. I mean, not exactly the stuff of exorcisms and Hollywood chillers, but in 1896, for weeks on end in France, there's a disembodied voice that seems to know everybody's personal life, and when the police come in, shouts out, "Get out of here, you with your dirty boots on." It's not chilling, it's not evil, it's not frightening, but it's interesting because it looks like it knows what's going on in real time. I don't think this could be explained as ventriloquism and so forth. So I think it's possible that some poltergeist cases are just human weirdness, and others do seem to involve a ghost. It's hard to rule that out.
Mm-hmm. So an entity from another dimension, or you see, the thing when you hear fundamentalist Christians talk, they often think that any kind of ghost or poltergeist is demonic. If you go more towards New Age philosophy, it tends to be a spirit that has just not passed on to the next life. Have you had experiences that would cause you to believe one way or the other, or are you still open on that one?
It's tantalizingly difficult, to be sure, but I'll give you a couple of cases that will give you some food for thought on this. I do think there's a sense, you're right, that people haven't realised they're dead, as it were, or for some reason they were murdered, there was suicide, they had a violent accident, they haven't been able to just pass on, as it were, easily, and they haunt the place where they were. Now, one of these cases is from the book, and it's a 19th century case. And the witness in this case actually, and he's not alone at all, he actually goes to court because of how concerned he is. And he turns up in a London civil court, I think it is, in 1826, and he tells this story to the magistrate, as you might imagine, is very kind of irritable, and this is a cock and bull story and all the rest of it. And our witness, Mr. Dunn, is equally indignant that he's not being believed. So he says he's in his lodgings in London, and he sees an apparition. And the apparition, first of all, says exactly these words. He says, "Wetherell, clean my boots and prepare my supper." Now, Wetherell is nobody in the room. There's no such person. So what I infer from this is that he's in his own time, he's in his own dimension, he's alive as far as he's concerned, and he's talking to his servant, his valet, whatever it might be. Now, poor old Dunn is greatly terrified, and he gets up, he opens the shutters, he's in an utter state of horror. And the apparition, which has disappeared, now turns up again, and it says to him, "I am the ghost of a murdered man. My body is not far from hence. Seek it, and you shall find it." So it's for this reason, really, that Dunn goes to court and feels that he's got to tell this story. What we seem to have here is a kind of slippage where it's as though the ghost is adjusting from one reality to another, and it realises that it's in the presence of someone who can help him in a sense, so he fits that profile of someone who's been murdered, can't pass on, and so forth. who I'll introduce just briefly, if I might, because he's one of the most remarkable characters in paranormal circles, as it were, of the last century. He's a character called Matthew Manning, and in the late 60s, as a teenager at a boarding school and at his family home, he had tremendous amount of poltergeist activity around him, extremely well documented, and I think here, as in other cases I've seen, you'd really call what happened to Manning, a lot of it a matter of public record. He's in a boarding school with a lot of other boys. Of course, there are staff, there's the headmaster, there's the matron, etc., teachers, and the headmaster's in a great dilemma at times, doesn't know, must he send Manning home, it's causing trouble to the other boys, and so on. Just to give you the broad picture of Manning's life, there's something very interesting about him, and this is what I mean by physical details being interesting. It's said that Uri Geller, who's obviously made a living out of being peculiar in some sense, had a severe electric shock when he was a child. Manning had a very severe electric shock when he was in his mother's womb. He wasn't expected to be born alive, but he was. Now, Manning's brain has been studied, it produces odd waves and so forth. What does all this mean? Well, what we know it means is that Manning has spent his life, and he's still doing it now, he's in his early 60s, I think, as a psychic healer, something I wouldn't know what to make of if you told me he was such a thing 15 years ago. But having read 2 of his books and read a lot of these other accounts, I would say that there is something genuine about Manning. He's recognised by, I think it's the World Cancer Organisation, for example, among other things. And if he's purely fraudulent, I don't really know how he's made a living for decades out of doing what he does. Now, the kind of in-between stage between Manning's poltergeist sufferings and his making a successful life out of being odd, if you like, not in a pejorative sense, is his ghost experiences. And this is far too long to tell in much detail, but I recommend the book highly. It's one of the most extraordinary books I've read. It's called The Strangers, and it's called The Strangers in the sense that, if you know the famous ghost film The Others, is called that. The Strangers are not the ghost. Oh, it is just one ghost. The Strangers are the Mannings, and the ghost of a man called Thomas Webb in their old Cambridgeshire house in, I think it's East Linton. The ghost who lived there in the 18th century was a big gentleman. He was a kind of a snob, really, big social figure. And he doesn't seem to understand that he's dead. He doesn't seem to understand why the Mannings are in his house. The Mannings' father, the father of the house, Matthew Manning's dad, more than once, I think, reports very odd experiences when he's lying in bed and somebody seems to be lying in there with him. It's hard to explain in a few words, but I mean, he even hears sounds like the scratching of somebody's stubble close to him in the bed. And yeah, this is where Webb would be if he was alive. Of course, it's the master bedroom. It's a sign of his status and so on. So for months and years, I think, on and off, the phenomena come and go. They're timed for certain parts of the year. They seem to happen more, I think, in midwinter and midsummer. Manning knows. He's a very good observer. Objects appear from nowhere, and some of them I think the Mannings kept. A very old loaf of bread, pages of a book, I think old knives, all sorts of things. And Manning sees the ghost of Webb. He's a portly, shortish man who has bad legs, walks on 2 sticks, on their staircase one day. After that, he's mainly just inferred, but very precisely inferred, because Manning will sit with a pen and he will write what Webb seems to be saying to him. It comes across in what you might call 18th century spelling, and it comes across with bafflement on the part of Webb when they say to Webb, well, we've just been to X place in so many minutes. Well, how did you do that? Of course, you can do this by a horse and carriage. So Webb is in a very odd state, really. He seems to be in 2 places at once, if you like. And one of the kind of climatic moments of Manning's account, I've just been rereading, extraordinary moment, when if you ever smell something odd in what you think is a haunted house, if you've got nerve for it, I would recommend that you follow that smell. I've heard many accounts of smell of tobacco smoke, burnt toast, perfume, etc., etc. Now, Manning smells, as he has many times, tobacco smoke, but it's very, very strong. He thinks there's somebody smoking a pipe, and he starts to think, look, he's walking through the house smoking. So he follows the scent of this smoke. He goes upstairs. His parents are in the house, but right across, far away, the big house. And he goes to where the smell is strong. He then goes to his sister's bedroom, and the sister can't smell anything. He goes to his parents' bedroom, opens the door, and in there, in the dark, after a few moments, first it seems to be empty, the smell is very strong, he sees Webb standing across the room by the wardrobe on his two sticks. And interestingly, Webb doesn't seem to see him. He's looking towards him. He looks absolutely solid. He's in colour. But he looks like, and it's not the first time I've heard this, and I've heard it from somebody I knew quite well, he looks like a waxwork. So if you imagine somebody that kind of has everything human, but if you like, animation, almost a soul, as it were, which is what animation really means. So Manning very carefully bends around, turns the light on. Webb's still there. He thinks, am I dreaming? He closes his eyes. He opens again. Webb's still there. He runs to his sister's room and says, can I have something to give to Webb? He says to his sister, do you want to come and see his sister? No fear, no fear. So he goes back with a little doll, the little thing that'll fit in your hand, and having already shaken hands with Webb, and he finds his hand just shakes thin air, he says, look, I want to give you something. So two things happen in I don't know, a matter of minutes. When he speaks to Webb, it's almost as though he's put a coin in the slot of some kind of waxwork machine, and it comes to life. It lights up. He's animated. He's aware of Manning. He sees him. He interacts, as it were, with him, and he speaks. And he says, "My legs are bad." Very typical. Anyway, when Manning is ready to give this responsive figure the doll, he holds it out, and Webb snatches it from his hand quite quickly, and something very interesting happens here. I, not surprisingly, can't fully explain it, but within seconds, I think, after he's taken this doll, which I think disappears, Webb begins to fade. He begins to fade from the edges. He begins to go grey from the edges, and he fades inward until he's purely grey, and then he disappears. So make of this what you will, but it's nothing if not very precise, and it suggests that two things: that we give life to ghosts in a curious sense, that they use our energy in a very definite, albeit mysterious sense, and that also a certain degree of interaction between our world and their world will send them away, if you see what I mean. That you put this real thing into Webb's hand, he takes it, but it breaks him up, as it were, and he's gone.
Mm-hmm. Now, that brings up a good question here, I think. I don't know if you've studied this, but when you said the thing about something being in this world and another world, have you encountered people who've had near-death experiences who are then very, how would I say this? They're very aware now of entities around them because they've kind of been on both worlds.
Yes, I have encountered this. I've encountered it personally, and I've encountered it in a historic case, which I think you'll be surprised at, given who was involved. The personal case was told to me by a woman I met. Again, she used to meet a lot of people going to a pool in Durham, and the number of these people that told me plausible ghost stories, I don't know if it runs into 20 maybe, but this woman I hadn't met many times, talking about what I was doing about ghosts, and she had a very, very serious accident, very serious car accident a few years ago, I think. She'd had surgery, and she'd been lying in fairly immediate aftermath on the hospital
gurney?
Surgical. Actually, she was lying in the operating theatre. Sorry, mine went blank. Sorry. So she's lying there, feeling really rough, blood all over her face, about to go under, and she feels a hand on her shoulder, and she thinks that it's the surgeon, the anaesthetist, whatever. She turns around, and it is her grandfather. And he's looking at her with a feeling of reassurance. You know, it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. Now, her grandfather at this point was dead. She wasn't expecting to see a ghost. She was the kind of person that was interested in ghosts. But that happened to her. She pulled through, of course, happily enough. But the other case, among many, actually, very many experiences of people who are either actually dying or think they're dying, is an extraordinary thing, and it's something that anyone interested in ghosts needs to know, because sometimes when you think you've seen a ghost of the dead, there's quite good odds that you've seen a ghost of somebody who's alive. Now, you have to just excuse, I think there's a bit of a knock at the door, but it's election night here in Cardiff, so it's a bit of a busy night. I have voted, I'm happy to say. So the case that I'm thinking of here comes from the 19th century, and it's somebody who writes into the Daily Telegraph newspaper, because a lot of people at this time are writing about their ghost experiences with a current story going on. We get a great slew of these letters I think wouldn't have turned up without this kind of prompt. And this character who writes in says that when he was young, he was learning to swim, and he got out of his depth, he nearly drowned, he was suffocating, and then he suddenly went into a state, I think it's been described quite a few times, of his life passing before him in a flash. He felt pleasantly swooning, he felt okay, he felt fine. Then he could see his mother in her house, and he was as it were there, back in the house where she was sitting. He talked to his mother later. He pulled through, as it happened, and survived. He talked to his mother later, and she said at this time that she felt very, very anxious about him, and as though something was happening to him. He goes on to say that if it had been night time and everything was peaceful, he was pretty sure that she would actually have seen him. And he says this on the basis of the fact that his own wife's mother had the experience of sitting in her room one night, and her mother, so Maskelyne's grandmother, actually appeared. And she thought, what's going on? She appeared, she disappeared. A few hours later, she found that her mother, so this chap's grandmother, had just died. So that's two classes of apparition, as it were. They tend to be called crisis apparitions, where the person is in danger of dying, or they're actually dying. And as I've let slip here, you might have heard, this character was Maskelyne, a great stage magician, a great illusionist, and a great unmasker of fake spiritualists, as he saw them, of spiritualism in general. But he was quite clear that he'd had an experience which made him believe in at least certain classes of apparitions. This would be, fairly similar to somebody from Psychop in modern times, perhaps a magician, for example, suddenly saying, well, yeah, I've unmasked all these people, but I also believe in this because it's happened to me.
Mm-hmm. So getting back to one of your original statements then, do you still consider yourself an agnostic?
I think that my belief on this has changed greatly since, about 4 or 5 years ago when I started researching it. I'm much more open now to the possibility that there's some kind of survival of consciousness, that there is, as you say, another dimension. I mean, that makes a lot of sense, that things seem to slip, and objects as well as people, between these dimensions. I don't particularly necessarily want to believe this, but I find that it's irresponsible to write it off, given the amount of evidence there is for it. What does it mean if there is survival of consciousness? I'm not prepared to believe that means that one religion or another is true, that their afterlife is true. I think that's a leap too far to try and underwrite all their precise claims because of these experiences. But when you talk to people who are themselves very, very rationalistic, very scientific, they will say to you, well, the strangest thing about human beings is consciousness. It is a weird thing. So with that basis in mind, the fact that it's got a resilience, that it can survive in various states, I'm prepared to believe. But, it's a big leap to start saying what this afterlife means, what it involves, and so forth. I think there's a lot in the paranormal that really needs investigating, and I think it's pretty tragic that we've turned this into a new taboo, effectively. effectively, and that people are frightened to talk about what's happened to them, and that they're mocked, that they're ignored, and they're told to shut up, by their parents in some cases.
Yeah, I've heard people that have had near-death experiences, and they keep their experience quiet from their relatives. For instance, if maybe it's a teenager and their parents are atheists or something.
Right, yes. I mean, another oddity in that area is that children and teenagers genuinely do seem much more likely to see ghosts. I've given an account of a case like that, I think, on your other programs. I won't rehash it, but there are plenty of cases where a parent is confronted by a child saying, "Mummy, who is the pretty lady in the corner?" And the poor parent, there's nobody there, and the kid's not frightened. The kids tend not to be frightened of ghosts, partly because they haven't learned to be frightened of ghosts, I think. But they're convinced they're there, and in one particular case, which is known to me, it's a fairly recent case, the child says this, the parent kind of talks them out of it, but the child is very precise. The person looks like this, and this. He's reading a newspaper. A couple of weeks after the incident has happened, there's been a fair bit of paranormal stuff going on in the house as well, which is an old house. They're at an local art gallery, and this is in the 90s, incidentally. The kid grabs the mother's arm, points into the corner. That's him. That's the man I saw. Now, this was a portrait of the man who was very closely associated with the house for producing a lot of the work in it. It's a beautiful showpiece Victorian house. It was the 1990s. There was no way this kid could have got hold of this image on the internet. They knew the person's name, but they simply didn't know what he looked like. And that's not the only case. When someone said, "Look, I saw this person in my room last night," and the owner of the house where they're staying says, "Have a look at this painting," and they say, "Yep, that's them," and they say, "Well, they died 70 years ago."
Mm-hmm. Now, since most people think in a dualistic way, you have good versus evil and so forth, are there cases that you've run across where ghosts have been there to assist people, like maybe relatives, and have there been cases where they've been much more harmful to people?
Yes. In the first case, interesting one, from Wales in the early 20th century, I think it was, and there's a family where I think there's two brothers, three initially. One of them dies young of something like consumption. There's a period when people could die very young, and he then comes back, and he constantly kind of helps or protects one of his living brothers. I think this boy called Herbert. And for example, interesting point where Herbert is about to drink a glass of milk or a cup of milk, and the invisible ghost of his brother dashes it out of his hand onto the floor. Now, this fits, as it turns out, with seeming kind of telepathy, you might even say omniscience of a few ghosts, in that the milk turns out to be sour. So he knows this. How does he know this? I don't know. But he's trying to protect his brother. In the countryside, he follows his brother around and he opens gates for him. This is somebody who's protective, who you would expect, I suppose, to be protective because he's his relative. There's also a case in the present book that I've just published where a mother has said to her husband, who's abusive, I think, to her, but also to the children, says, if you ever harm those children after I'm dead, I will come back and haunt you. And she does. She does. This is quite a precisely detailed case. And she comes back and plays havoc with his life, mainly as a poltergeist, if you like, which is, of course, a restless spirit, an angry spirit. Yes, those are two cases where there's definite intention, where you can see the logic, you can see the backstory. A more mysterious case, but an absolutely tragic case, really, where I think if I'd suffered a poltergeist and I'm talking to somebody at the moment in America who's suffered one for over 4 years, and it's a very difficult time. I think at the very least I want people to listen to me sympathetically. If people said that I was mad, that I was psychologically projecting this, I was making it up, I can't think of, many experiences that would be worse, because if, you'd suffered violence, murder, etc. of one of your family members, the odds are that people would actually believe it had happened. So this case was a French case in a place called Isère in France, well, initially in Isère, and it was a family called the Saboreaux. They suffered a poltergeist from 1877 until at least 1897. After that, as it were, the trail goes cold. We don't know if it went on longer, but it went on for at least 20 years. Very curious. I think there was something odd about the whole family, because the poltergeist began about 8 years before the birth of the first daughter, and then as the first daughter grew up, it very clearly followed her around. She's a girl called Renee, and it followed her into other people's houses, friends' houses, so there are quite a lot of witnesses. Interesting detail, if we recall, Esther Cox, who swelled up almost as though she was going to burst. The father said to reporters, this was thoroughly in the newspapers after a while, said Renee's face is very swollen today. We always know there's going to be a shindy, there's going to be trouble when her face is swollen. So interestingly precise correlation between people who couldn't have met up and got their stories straight, as it were. So yeah, a lot of noises, a lot of hammering, very weird footsteps. I mean, footsteps like something, a monster from a Hollywood film walking down your stairs, so heavy that it sounds like the stairs are going to break in the night. And basically what happens to these people is, although the father is a skilled man, he's a building contractor, I think a mason, he's initially, when the story starts, trying to work on a church, he cannot survive, because he cannot stay where he needs to do his work. The family literally flees from one place to another, perhaps almost knowing that this is hopeless, because they fled, by the time we get to 1897, the stories in the papers, they've been all over France, I think, and they found it doesn't work. But you have to try and do something, I suppose, when nobody else can help you. And not surprisingly, it didn't happen sooner, really, but by about 1897, or maybe a bit before, I think in at least 2 locations, Poitiers and I think Paris, they get pursued and harassed by local people who believe that there's witchcraft involved. People's beliefs in witchcraft, easily survived into the 20th century in many places. So they were kind of hounded out of where they lived, but because he couldn't hold a stable contract down on a job either. And this case is very well detailed. It checks out a bunch of lawyers, I think from Paris maybe, but a bunch of serious kind of rational people, fairly sceptical, turned up in the house. They stayed a few days, and they said, yeah, this is what we heard. There is something going on here. So what was doing that? Was it a ghost? Was it just bad luck? I think there was clearly something odd about the family that allowed them to be haunted. Was it just a physical thing about them that let the ghost through one dimension to another? Did the ghost have an agenda that it wanted to tell them? It's hard to know what that would be. There's no evidence of that. But yeah, in a way that isn't full of crucifixes, spinning heads, sinister overtones and Hollywood, whatnot. This wrecked their lives.
Mm-hmm. Now, in a related note, the idea that ghosts can help people. I was watching a documentary that said that in the Viking era, people used to, if they needed help, if they found their life was in a crisis, they would go and spend the night sitting or laying on the grave of one of their ancestors.
Okay.
And in a lot of other cultures, like, there's just a lot of cultures that still persist in this idea of honoring the dead, because there's an idea that a ghost could come, and there's either that the ghost can do you harm, but also that it could do you good. Now, do you find that maybe people who today are so skeptical they block themselves off from any of these kinds of experiences or intuitions or whatever that people maybe more traditional or coming in? I mean, England has a lot of people that have come in from other parts of the world in recent years. Are they? Have you found that they have more experiences with this because they come from cultures that actually still see this as a viable thing?
I've come across one case told to me in person about that, which was a guy from, I think, Jamaica, but an older guy, so it's his son telling the story. His son is kind of baffled, and I think faintly thinks his father's a bit wacky, but I listened to the details and I said to him, look, that sounds like a ghost. He's not making that up, actually. It was fiddling around with his bedclothes, very classic stuff. It made it with the bedclothes get your attention when you're trying to get to sleep. That's one case. On a much, much bigger scale, huge scale, to be honest with you, I'm on a list of recipients of poltergeist cases currently happening around the world, and we get them, it varies one week to another, but you can easily get half a dozen in a week, and they're almost all from the developing world. They're from India, they're from parts of Africa, South Africa, the Philippines, and I think the point here is probably, certainly one point is that people are happy to talk. The whole community will support you. The whole community will believe you. The story will then get reported. The story will get into the papers. It will circulate. And as I say, all the people I've talked to, very cagey. So the stories are there. The experiences have been had. Maybe marked their lives in some ways because they happened when they were children. So one level, that's interesting. But the other level that's even more interesting in a way is the sense that there's something about a blank attitude, an open-minded attitude that allows you to see a ghost. Many, many cases of children seeing ghosts, one I've just mentioned where it looks like it is objectively verified after the mother can't see it. And this blankness intriguingly matches up with the blankness of technology. So somebody I'm talking to at the moment, Keith Linder, is trying to publish a book on his experiences with a poltergeist stroke ghost. It's really made his life pretty difficult. It's followed him around from one house to another. It's followed him many times to hotels where he travels for work. He's luckily an IT professional, so the ghost is messing with the wrong person. He's really wired his house up to monitor all of this. And he's come across something that's well known now called electronic voice phenomena. And this means that you set a tape running, you have a conversation with somebody else in the house, investigator in this case, and you play back the tape and you hear something that you did not hear when you were talking in real time. So, to give you an example, they're setting the place up for filming and monitoring. They've got a team, investigators in there, and there's a door that the poltergeist ghost opens quite a lot. So Keith says, shall we leave it open or shut? And the investigator says, shut. So they play back the tape, and you hear the conversation, shall we leave it open or shut? Shut. You hear a voice behind, as it were, underneath, saying, they will just walk through. There are many examples of that where, like children, really, like naughty children, the poltergeist ghost is just trying to get his attention. It's continually saying, Keith, Keith, Keith. He sometimes says it and he hears it, but quite often he has to work very, very hard. Luckily, he's very technically savvy, and he plays back recordings and he timestamps them and so forth. And you're hearing it. It's very faint, it's difficult, but it's there. You're hearing this voice saying, Keith. You hear these people having conversations with each other. They're looking at the technology, saying, what is that, and so forth. You've got that. You've got the fact that a lot of ghosts that you didn't see when you were there turn up on a photograph. I'm sure that lots have been faked, but a lot of them do look like they correspond to something that other people have seen at certain times. The blankness, as it were, of recording equipment, the blankness of a child that hasn't been told this is impossible, this is what's right, this is what's true, rigid rules, and so on. These join up in a surprisingly precise way.
Yeah, speaking of the fake stuff, how do you feel about? I mean, how do you feel about? There's a lot of these TV shows on now,
Sure.
where it just seems that people go into an old house and they turn on. It's always at night, and they turn on night vision goggles, and so everything's green and stuff like that. How do you feel about these shows? Do you think some of them might be legit? Some of them are just, people playing around and just trying to get views, or what?
I think there's become an appetite and a market for a kind of ambiguous thrill, if you like. So I think that market depends on the fact that people don't really believe in this, because if they did, to the degree that people believed in it in the 19th century, they could literally be scared to death. There's many, many cases where people were literally frightened to death by either a ghost or really what looks like a comically crude hoax, but was tragic because the victim, when somebody threw a white sheet over themselves, jumped out on them, went into a state of shock, foamed at the mouth maybe, never kind of came out of it, just sort of paralysed, shut down, died in 1 to 3 days. So, yeah, I think when you're playing around with this, you're in a culture where you want to be excited a little bit, people drunk at night playing with a Ouija board, that kind of thing. I think, to be fair, I judge every case on its own merits. So you'd have to know more about individual cases, because I think some people will call in these people. They don't know who else to turn to be fair. They might have been rejected by the clergy. They're often pretty useless, to be honest, in recent times. They might have, been told by a doctor they've got some psychological problems. They might have gone to the press and had people running, mocking comments about the story. They might have gone to the police who said, yeah, there's something up, but we don't know what to do about it, basically. The police are very good witnesses of this, and there's some very, very convincing police reports on them. So, yeah, I think, it doesn't tend to happen at night. It certainly, as I say, I haven't watched these shows myself, but it doesn't tend to have that sinister overtone of evil. It's very often playful. It's about as wicked as a naughty child. It seems to have the psychology of a naughty child, wants attention, will keep going till it gets your attention. If you like, in terms of harm, physical harm, something very odd about poltergeist cases where stones rain down in a house, and they will rain down from nowhere. They will appear from a foot below the ceiling. They will look like the stones that are outside lying wet and cold on the ground, but they will be hot or warm and dry, and they will never hurt anybody. There's a very tiny handful of cases where these have caused actual physical harm, but there are less than 1%, I think, of the documented cases, and most of the time it's absolutely improbable that if someone was hoaxing, they could throw hundreds of stones around and never hurt anybody, that they fall far too slowly for gravity, if you like, odd trajectories and so forth. So, yeah, this really, as somebody commented, I think, when they made a remake of the Enfield poltergeist case from Britain, they used, I don't know, purportedly used the book, which is an excellent account of an extraordinary case. As people commented when the film had come out, if they'd just stuck to what was in the book, it would have been much more extraordinary than the film they made. It might not have been as popular as Chilling, etc., but the real stuff is far stranger than fiction, much.
Okay, and we're running kind of short of time here, but when it comes to things like Ouija boards and stuff, do you think this is something people should play around with, or is it just, a game?
I think that's up to them. I think that there are a handful of genuine mediums. I think if somebody's suffering what seems to be perhaps a ghost, then if you can get in touch with a good medium, these people can really help you. Again, they don't seem kind of spooky and mystic, as in the films. They're quite ordinary people with ordinary jobs. I think train driver and tube driver in one case, and a guy called Eddie Burks, who's now died himself, seemed to be a genuine medium, and left a lot of accounts of his experience trying to help people who were haunted. I believe he was once called into Coutts Bank. I think it's the oldest bank in London, and people had repeatedly complained about seeing a a chap without a head walking around who was supposed to be somebody from the, I think it was the 16th or 17th century, that had been beheaded under Elizabeth or one of the later monarchs. So there are genuine mediums, and they do seem to, have genuine curious powers for whatever reason. Ouija boards, I've no experience really. Perhaps if a ghost really wants to get through to you and you give it the pretext, it will. But the evidence I've seen, I've looked at a lot, seems to be that there has to be somebody who is a little bit unusual. Sometimes you'll just get a house that is thoroughly haunted. Whoever goes in there is going to get some phenomena. But a lot of the time you need somebody who is a bit unusual. And to be honest with you, if I'm going into a purportedly haunted house, if I was allowed to, I would want to take along a child and a dog. Would be the forms of technology that I would use.
Yeah, because they're open to what's around them, I guess.
They are, and they have senses that we don't have. In the case of a dog, particularly, they're clearly sensing all sorts of things. Sometimes they're friendly towards some ghost that seems to be there. Sometimes they're in a state of great terror, and sometimes they almost seem to sense, say, poltergeist rapping before anybody else hears it, as though there's a kind of build-up, there's a kind of energy precursor, as it were, that precedes the event heard by human ears, and the dogs get something before. And you're talking dogs here, by the way, that are absolutely, fearless in fights with people, with dogs, with, murderers with knives, but they will flee in abject terror from something that, nobody else can see.
Interesting. Okay, in this last moment here, how can people look up your new book?
Yes, if they want to get in touch with me with any ghost stories, that would be terrific. I'm on richardjsugg at yahoo.co.uk, and the book is available now on Amazon. I've tried to make it as affordable as I can, so I hope it will sell widely to a lot of people, and I hope it will get people talking, because I'm pretty sure that some of these readers will have had experiences, will have had people tell them things, and I can understand if they find in isolation these things difficult to believe, but once they get talking to other people, once they read these stories, I really hope it'll build up a bit of a critical mass and open up debate.
Okay, well, this sounds really interesting. I would really encourage people to look up that book as well as some of your other books that you've written. The only thing you have to do is type in, I guess, Richard Sugg into Google, or maybe put books, and you've got quite a bit out there. And so, anyway, well, thank you for coming on tonight.
Many thanks. It's really nice to talk to somebody open-minded. It's very refreshing. Thank you.
Hey, no problem. Anyway, and also I'd like to thank our audience for tuning in, and hope you come back next week for another edition of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV Productions. Take care now.